All right, let's talk about DHS funding. Doug Luzader with this piece, taking a look at what is all but certain going to lead in the next few hours into a partial government shutdown. Doug explains.
Well, Capitol Hill is emptying out, and while talks may continue in the background, it looks like a breakthrough is a long way off.
These are all the electronics or anything?
Agents aren't leaving their airport checkpoints anytime soon, but after midnight, the TSA says it will stop paying 63,000 workers. FEMA and the Coast Guard also get cut off.
The motion is not agreed to.
The final chance to fund the Department of Homeland Security before tonight's deadline failed yesterday, blocked by Democrats who are holding out for changes in immigration enforcement.
Today's strong vote was a shot across the bow to Republicans. Democrats will not support a blank check for chaos.
We have to protect our law enforcement, very important.
President Trump yesterday reiterated his concerns that some Democratic demands, including a ban on face masks for ICE agents, endangered law enforcement.
I have proposed, and President Trump has concurred, that this surge operation conclude.
And just hours before the vote, Border Czar Tom Homan announced an end to the immigration enforcement surge in Minnesota. But that wasn't enough to win over critics in Congress, and some questioned whether the shutdown would have much impact.
There's absolutely no reason for workers to be furloughed because there's more than enough money to keep those organizations operating for the next couple of weeks.
We got everybody? Okay, good.
The Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, though, said it was just a matter of time.
How long would you continue to show up for a job that you're not being paid for?
Now, it's possible that Congress could come back early if there's a deal, but as it stands, they're off all of next week. In Washington, Doug Luzader, Fox News.
All right, let's bring in national politics reporter for the Associated Press, Meg Kinnard. She's here with me. You know, Meg, as Doug said at the end of that piece there, Congress now leaving for, I believe it's 10 days or so. Does that mean it's off the table that we could see DHS get funded in the interim? What are the chances that that happens?
I've always said that I'm not going to say never to just about anything, especially in this current political environment, but it is increasingly unlikely that we're going to see any movement on this issue, especially with Congress leaving town. And so therefore not being able to vote even if there is a deal that goes through. That's what has to happen. That's what we saw last fall with the disconnect between the schedules for the Senate and the House. And then even though the Senate had passed a measure, having to wait until the House was back and could therefore send that to President Trump to end that record 43-day shutdown we saw last year. But this time also gives more for negotiation. Potentially, we could see the needle move if the president and those Democrats who have been making those demands on which there is so far no agreement are able to continue having discussions. But for now, the reporting is correct that those furloughs will begin to happen. There could be some missed paychecks depending on how long this goes on. But there is at least some cover for both sides on this point in that the tax cuts bill from last year did fund a lot of what we are seeing actually paying for CPB and ICE and other DHS agencies right now. And so to Republicans' point, they're saying the shutdown isn't really going to do anything financially because there is already funding in place due to that legislation for this agency.
You know, the time is just about 7 p.m. in the nation's capital. Democrats are demanding better identification for ICE agents. They're demanding a new code of conduct for those agencies. They want more use of judicial warrants, among other requests. Meg, do we know how close the White House is to meeting the Democrats where they want?
At least from what we have heard recently from President Trump, not very close. He has said unequivocally that he doesn't believe that the demands the Democrats are making about masks, for example, not being something that's available for federal agents. He doesn't believe that that should be an option. And we will see in terms of the code of conduct, that has been a big measure for Democrats saying that they want to see more accountability. President Trump has also been very vocal in his support for DHS Secretary Kristi Noem when he has been asked, does he believe that she should stay in the job? That's something we've heard from a lot of Democrats as well as even a couple of Republicans saying that she should leave. But him voicing support for her, that's somewhat outside necessarily just this shutdown, but it's all related. It's all about those enforcement actions that have roiled the country, that have a lot of Democrats particularly upset in seeing what's been playing out in cities like Minneapolis. But for the president, he has been behind his cabinet secretary, and he has said that he supports her. And with making the change and bringing in Tom Homan, at least that has been surmised by some to be some sort of not a give from the administration, but at least an acknowledgement that with Gregory Bovino on the ground in Minneapolis, it was perhaps time to make a change. And so that was a bit of a conciliation point for those who had been requesting and demanding a change of leadership on the ground in cities like Minneapolis.
So there might be some people at home wondering, don't Republicans have control of both chambers of Congress? How do Democrats have the leverage to block something like this?
In all of these situations, it all comes down to politics. And when there are these narrow margins, that's always something that congressional leaders in both chambers are doing the math constantly, especially when contentious issues like this come up, and figuring out how many votes do we have to make sure that we have over what is absolutely necessary. And those margins are extremely small. Also, in an election year, there are going to be some members who, if they are not running again, we've seen this in the Senate with some Senate Republicans being willing to perhaps call into question some moves that the administration has been making, more so than maybe they would have if they were running again. Those members who aren't, or who at least maybe feel like in their districts, in their states, they might have a bit of cushion for being able to take a different tack. That's kind of some of what we're seeing too, but really it does come down to the congressional math. And with the numbers being as close as they are, in this election year, everybody's thinking about that, but particularly when it comes to legislation like this, that does provide that window for there to be a debate, even when both chambers are held by the same party. And let's not forget, just because members are Republicans, that doesn't mean that they always necessarily agree on every single point. I do most of my reporting, and I live in South Carolina, where both chambers of our state legislature have been held by Republicans for quite some time. And I often see this play out here at home when measures that the governor, who is also a Republican, or someone else is trying to get through, they don't necessarily have success because even within those political factions, there's a lot of difference of opinion.
Yeah, what feels like the most likely path to eventually getting the funding going in the future?
That's a great question. If you have a crystal ball, I'm very willing to look into it. But it does seem that there is a little bit of a window here for these conversations to continue, particularly, as I noted before, because there is funding in place to keep a lot of these essential jobs going. During the last shutdown, according to DHS data, only 5% of its employees were actually furloughed. Most of those employees for this entire agency are considered essential, and therefore they stay on the job. There may be missed paychecks if this does drag out, but the work will still be done. We'll see what happens at airports. TSA is also under DHS, and we all know from the last shutdown, if workers don't show up for those security lines, there can be some delays. But the fact that there is funding, that this work, that different agents on the ground and in other places within DHS will be continuing to do their work, at least there's that. We're not going to see what we saw government-wide, for example, during the last shutdown with SNAP benefits being missed and other checks not going out to Americans. That's not as much of a case here. This is very narrow. And perhaps, I don't know, of course, but perhaps with the de-escalation of government activities in Minneapolis, for example, that news that came out today that you all just reported on, there could be a bit of a cooling in the temperatures around a lot of what has driven this debate with the constant images of what was happening on the ground in places like Minneapolis coming out and continuing to roil tensions. Sure, this week we saw a lot of very contentious debate in the congressional committees that we're hearing from the heads of agencies like ICE and CBP and some others within DHS. But without that continuing, without the on-the-ground presence, if temperatures do get a bit cooler, I would predict that there is a little bit more room for some of those substantive conversations to continue.
Have a good weekend, Meg. Thank you.